and I just want to remind everyone that in this seminar series, we talk about, well, let's just say challenging subjects. And so we expect everybody to be professional at all times. So what's going to happen is I will monitor the chat window. Please feel free to type in questions in the chat window. Everything in the chat window is recorded. Everything in the presentation is recorded. So just keep it civil, and that's all we ask for. I have already received some questions from our students here. Some of these are fairly challenging, but I tend to alternate back and forth from questions that have been pre-submitted and in the chat window. So feel free to ask questions. I'll monitor the chat window so Martin doesn't have to. And with that, let me introduce our speaker here. And so our speaker today is Martin Pfeiffer from the University of New Mexico. His research explores the history of our relationship to nuclear weapons. His research indicates that our distorted official nuclear history hampers us from acknowledging and fixing past and ongoing harms from nuclear energy projects. And he argues that this distorted history threatens democratic governments by concealing social movements around weapons. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for inviting me. So let's play with the technology from the beginning. So when I have it set up like this with presenting to everybody, I can't see anything. So Jeff, if you need to break in, please do so.
Not a problem.
Orally. This also means I can't see audience feedback. So if I start like speaking Greek or Russian, which I took but am not able to speak fluently, just yell at me. Right, our wonderful title page, which we are going to skip rapidly to get into the who am I? I am a journalist, gonzo journalist, anthropologist. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New Mexico in anthropology. The subfield, because of the way my department is set up, is weird, is ethnology. I consider myself a nuclear abolitionist, so we can also talk about that and what that means if you like. My Twitter and contact. Oh, I didn't put my email. We can talk. You can find me on Twitter. One of the important links on here is to my Nuke and NatSec archive, which has something like 28 gigabytes of national security and nuclear weapon records that I've gotten from Freedom of Information Act reading rooms by filing freedom.
Are you advancing your slides?
No, not yet.
Okay, because the slides are not advancing. All right, so.
Yes, no, we're still on Who Am I?
All right. No,
thank you.
Well, who am I? So that's our problem. We're not seeing Who Am I.
Oh, all right. Can you see acknowledgements?
All we see are nuclear weapons and society and you.
Okay, what about now?
Now I see acknowledgements. So go ahead and go back one. Now I see Who Am I. All right. I have no idea what happened and why it did not go on, but now I see it.
Okay, can you see all? Can you see all of them, or just the big one?
We see all of them in the one in the middle. So
I think that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, it's probably as good as it gets. So go ahead.
Okay, moving on. Because technology, yay, the plague.
I love technology. Right?
Yes, techno enthusiasm is a long-standing United States thing. But in any case, so the public archive, free digital, that I run is one of the projects that I'm fairly proud of, insofar as I'm proud of any of my projects at this moment. Special thank you, of course, to Jeff for the invitation and for the years of discussion and friendship. And then, of course, as a colleague says, like a race car, I have sponsors. And thank you, to the university, to my patrons, and to all the folk who are generously enable me to being able to do and share my work. That's one of my favorite Khrushchev pictures because he's just so happy about that corn. Be aware, this is the first time I've given this particular version of the talk. So there may be a little bit of disfluency now and again, but this topic we can go on for hours. And if I end a little bit early, that's just a little bit more time for question and answer is kind of how I look at it. But so as Jeff already went through, right, there are certain arguments that I'm making. And also I want to do this in a way that's not boring and awful and involving, a discussion of theory and then, kind of like a standard presentation. So, right, what are we discussing? My three arguments, as Jeff already kind of offered a hint as to what I'm going to argue, right? And one of it is that museums, especially these official sites of nuclear weapons heritage, and we'll talk about what I mean by official sites of nuclear weapons heritage in a moment, are important because a lot of people go to them and they continue to act to shape our imaginaries or how we think about past, present, and future nuclear violence, state citizenship, and nuclear energy projects. I also argue that information management, what we could also refer to as information security or secrecy, particularly as we see it in these official heritage spaces, are a form of governmentality. And this is one of those reasons that I'm telling it in a story, right? So by governmentality, I mean that processes of information management and also of transparency, so filing Freedom of Information Act requests, are ways that people, by going through them, articulate and connect themselves to the state and state structures. So when I file a Freedom of Information Act request, I may be, like, hey, give me this information, but there's also a process to go through, and one has to adapt oneself to the process or be really rich and able to sue a lot because it's about $10,000 off the bat, I've learned. And then sort of the final point, right, that in general, as a trend, and certainly together, the network of current contemporary U.S. official nuclear weapon heritage sites tends to reproduce a particular, what I refer to as a corrosive or toxic U.S. nuclear mythology. And I'm using the term mythology in like the folkloric and the anthropologist sense. So, right, a sacred narrative that explains how the world is and how it got to be this way and how it should be, and whose truth value is oftentimes kind of like held in abeyance. It's sacred. It explains the way the world is. We don't really deal with it necessarily in terms of truthhood or falsity. Although in this case, because of its secular or supposedly secular status, we do a little bit more than you might see with certain other mythologies. And we can just we'll touch on what that U.S. nuclear mythology is in just a moment. And we're also discussing one mystery. What is that mystery? We'll find out in a moment. But it's this through a discussion of this mystery and my efforts to solve it that we will discuss my arguments. Right. So first off, or not first off, but we do need to define our terms. What is official nuclear weapon heritage? And I'm pulling this term out of Rodney Harrison's work on critical heritage studies. He argues that we can refer to, quote unquote, official nuclear weapons heritage as that which is chartered by the state and run in accordance with a particular now international set of disciplinary and norms and practices. And at this point, given the various UNESCO and the various heritage industry and the various treaty regimes, I mean, we're literally speaking about a heritage regime. Excuse me. In my own research, I would also suggest that, at least in the United States, official nuclear weapon heritage tends to have its message overdetermined by the actual structure of the heritage site and its processes of function. By message overdetermined, I mean that the form of for instance, of a nuclear weapons museum is going to be partly determined by who's funding it, who gets hired to run it. In some cases, is it directly chartered by Congress, as two nuclear weapon heritage sites are? Are the volunteers mostly from the local National Nuclear Weapons Lab? does the local National Nuclear Weapons Lab fund your museum very generously? Are you displaying weapons casings on loan from the National Nuclear Security Agency? Because if you are, or other nuclear weapon related materials that you're borrowing from them, if you are, they're going to insist that you follow contemporary DOE classification, Department of Energy classification guidelines and practices when you discuss those items, which if you're volunteering at a nuclear weapon heritage site and you've never held a clearance, and one of your fellow volunteers were to accuse you, not accuse you, were to vehemently say, hey, you can't say that, that's classified, and you look at them and you say, you're right, I've never held a classification. That's one of those things I mean by museums and official nuclear weapon heritage as being social processes of governmentality and knowledge production and circulation, right? So if you're volunteering there, you are required, if you're going to continue volunteering at many of these sites, to reproduce a particular set of knowledge guidelines that you may or may not have familiarity with because you may or may not have ever had a clearance. This is also where we get into, well, what are the classified categories of information that you're supposedly, that supposedly nobody knows. And it includes active storage locations. So if, for instance, if you are volunteering at a site in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is home to the Kirtland Underground Munitions and Maintenance Storage Complex, which is potentially the largest national level nuclear weapons storage complex in the country, the Secretary of the Air Force has been on the front page of the local paper talking about this giant nuclear weapons storage complex about 8 miles away from me. If one were to volunteer at the local nuclear weapons museum, literally the existence of that storage complex, which has been on the front page, right, you can't mention it because active storage locations are classified, with a slight exception for NATO countries who admit to, NATO nuclear weapon sharing, right? This is one of my favorite examples of from the Titan II Missile Museum, where the didactic text explains hey, overkill is just a name given to force numbers and deployments that only seem excessive. In reality, it's about reliability, right? And it was about overkill. Like any arguments that by the 70s and 80s, U.S. nuclear weapons stockpiles and deployments were not overkill are really pretty laughable in many ways. And certainly the Titan II we held on to a bit longer than we probably should have, and for various political reasons, basically. And I'm sure that some people would argue the historiography of that with me, and we can. But the point being that the didactic text and the presentations at these institutions all kind of, just channel in a particular way. And so to briefly go through that sort of mythology, it is not necessarily fully instantiated at any given site, although usually or oftentimes it is, but it's basically a couple of elements. And that's that U.S. nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II and saved Japanese and American lives, that U.S. nuclear weapons kept the peace and won the Cold War for America, and that U.S. nuclear weapons remain, an absolutely necessary and foundational basis of United States security in the post-Cold War era. And then now we are seeing discourses about great power competition and the importance of nuclear weapons to that, right? So sort of no matter what the circumstances, it seems like some people think that nuclear weapons are the answer, whether you're dealing with potentially terrorist threats, great power competition, or, a period of unipolarity, supposedly. Where is official nuclear weapon heritage? This is a partial select list of some of the sites that I have and have not been to, but I selected them because they seem to be the ones that had the highest levels of visitation and the largest presence online and in terms of the literature about atomic tourism and nuclear weapons heritage. And we have until 12:30 30, right? That's a question. Okay, somebody's nodding.
12:40 your time.
Okay, so I'll go till 12:20. Okay, so we'll
Okay,
oh, good.
perfect.
Excellent, right? So I will go to about 12:20. All right, so where is official nuclear weapon heritage? The point of this whole big graph of, oh, good Lord, I left out the sources. I feel like an awful PhD student. Moving on, is that, something like 300 to 400,000 people go through just these sites alone. And that does not include, for instance, Pima Air and Space Museum, which has a section on, other museums that are not nuclear weapon focused, but that include nuclear weapons information, nuclear weapons materials, nuclear weapons artifacts, and that, again, continue to engage in this sort of nuclear mythology. The sort of other aspect of that is, in addition to those elements I mentioned, there's also an obscuring and erasure of both nuclear weapon and nuclear energy project harms, so like disproportionate impact of uranium mining on the Dene and Navajo Nation. And then there's also a dismemberment. That's the word I was looking for last night. A dismemberment in the presentation of anti-nuclear weapon peace and more moderate social movements, which I would also argue were incredibly important and critical to Cold War nuclear policies and what people felt that they could do. So if you look at the histories around Euro missiles, for instance, it's very clear that the political pressures constructed by large-scale mass movements were of great importance for both the United States and Europe in terms of what they felt that they could and couldn't do. And I argue, that by dismembering those and presenting them as disassociated elements, here's a trinket from, a Chernobyl liquidator's medal, here's a trinket from 3 Mile Island, rather than like, hey, let's talk about what was the largest protest movement in American history for a while, especially in 1982, which can offer examples for the current political moment. And moving on, and allow us to consider nuclear weapons as something that we built and that we can take apart, rather than nuclear weapons policy and nuclear weapons themselves as being this kind of sublime, out of reach, ephemeral, universal thing. So the mystery that I had mentioned and that I want to talk through with you is, what was the yield of the Davy Crockett nuclear weapon? And to answer that, we first have to ask, what was the Davy Crockett? Essentially, it was the numbers vary. You always had people for security and so on. Let's just say 5. You could theoretically do it with 2 or 3, but 2 to 3 person plus 2 on security, deployed nuclear bazooka, recoilless rifle, the M28 and the M29 versions. The official rationale, according to some documents that are now no longer available because they were reclassified, we'll talk about that in a moment, but the official rationale was theoretically a rapid nuclear response for U.S. Light infantry against fleeing targets of opportunity, against tanks, because tanks are really kind of hardened against certain nuclear effects. And honestly, the Davy Crockett was developed kind of for the sheer hell of it. The official rationale that I have seen explicated in archival and declassified documents has a little bit more of that, like, well, hell, we can, let's do it sort of thing, even to the point of how it was named. Sorry, I'm thinking of the Honest John in terms of its naming, but also Davy Crockett, right? Frontiers, frontline weapons, etc. So the reason that I have the didactic text up is that it gives a slight overview of what the Davy Crockett weapon was, the W-54 warhead, and then it makes a very particular claim. The Davy Crockett brought nuclear capability to the infantry and fired a powerful nuclear shell with acceptable danger of radiation to troops. Notice the yield is given in tons. How do we evaluate this claim, and why does it matter? I've already, given some of the reasons that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons that it matters at the end. But are we just going to buy? Are we going to just accept the museum's claim on this? And I would point out that most weapon yields, like almost all of them, for weapons that used to be in the stockpile, remain technically classified or reclassified. So on the left, you have the letter from the Department of Energy's classification folk explaining to me that my declassification proposal for the yield of the Davy Crockett was very carefully considered. But, so the former restricted data declassification working group carefully considered your declassification proposal and determined that the precise yields of the W-54 warhead and the actual yields of Little Feller 1 and 2 nuclear tests cannot be declassified at this time. However, the yield of the warhead is in the sub-kiloton range, right? This weapon was pulled out of the stockpile in the late 60s, early 70s. Most of the weapon types that we built have been retired. The only weapon yields I'm aware of that have been explicitly declassified are literally those of Fat Man, Little Boy, and then the 9 megaton W-53 warhead used on the Titan II, and then also for the B-53 nuclear bomb. And at one point, the U.S. also admitted that we had a warhead in our arsenal that went up to 25 megatons, right? This is odd because those things have been out of the stockpile for a very long time. We can ask why these are still classified. From whom is this information being kept secret? Since I guarantee you that the Soviets and then the Russians, probably certainly the Russians, were able to figure out what the likely warhead of the W-54 warhead for the Davy Crockett was, and this is the case for much of what we keep classified or not available to the public. And it matters in a museum setting in that with no weapon yields available, and not only that, but also there's no calibration of the weapon yields at the museum to what it actually means. Right? Here's what a 9 megaton nuclear weapon will do to Albuquerque, sort of thing. It's always discussed, at least at the sites I've been to, in this very abstracted way. So again, this, acting as an example of information management and of governance, right? What are we officially allowed to know about the Davy Crockett? Well, not the yield, apparently. And if we go to our next slide, we see that from RDD 8, which is the DOE 2002 restricted data declassification decisions up to 2002, and then I filed a Freedom of Information Act for any others since then. This is from that document. So it gives a general list of what remains classified and what has been declassified in declassified terms. And it mentions, back in the 60s, right? Only such, what was declassified with the Davy Crockett, only such information on the weight of the assembled Davy Crockett weapon as revealed by observation of the physical handling. Note should be taken of the great importance of safeguarding the yield of the Davy Crockett. On the right, you have a picture of them captioned "Mounting the Warhead" from Alex Wellerstein's wonderful blog, where he pulled that. You can follow for the provenance of that. And then on the left is a still from the Sandia documentary, Always Never, which I highly recommend, 3 volumes. See the works cited page. So, for whatever reason, they really wanted to keep the yield of the Davy Crockett secret, right? At some point, and I know that Jeff is gonna kind of roll his eyes at this one probably. At some point, cleanup operations of depleted uranium spotting rounds used in Hawaii for training for the Davy Crockett system resulted in an archival search being conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers, and in it included certain original documents, and they included a Department of Defense discussion of the operational concept for the Davy Crockett, and behold, we are told that the warhead is a Mark 54 Mod 2 unboosted sealed pit weapon with 26 pounds of high explosive and 51 pounds of weight, warhead only. Nominal yield, 20 tons. Warhead plus adaptation kit forms the Davy Crockett projectile, and that gives you a total weight of approximately 75 pounds. I thought that this was all incredibly secret, right? Like, how did this happen? You are welcome to search for this document. I have found, There is no copy of it, as far as I can tell, anywhere on any, DOE or any DoD websites. I intend to Freedom of Information Act it when I get my powers back to see what happens. What probably happened, and this is why anthropologists, and I in particular, would argue, right, we need to pay attention to the natural history of discourse, how particular texts and records reach us and what their histories are, who wrote them, who they were written for, whom they were written for, etc., etc. So the classification deities giveth, and we have Clinton's Executive Order 12958, which was part of the whole openness initiative, or at least got articulated into it. And a lot of the executive departments hated it. It set new rules about what had to be declassified automatically over time. Congress responded with the Kyle Lott amendments, which covered DOE and allow for DOE to go back through documents that have already been released and essentially reclassify them because supposedly they contain information that should never have been released. And weapon yields are classified. So, the CIA and other executive agreement agencies did not have congressional approval or budgeting. So they did it for years in secret, and in terms of going and removing documents from the National Archives that they claimed were made with resource, so the CIA will be like, all right, this document was made with quote unquote CIA equity, our funding and resources, and we didn't get asked about declassifying it. Now we want to reclassify it. I assume that that's what happened in this case, or something similar. So the link there to the National Security Archive will take you to their electronic briefing book on that reclassification program or aspects of it, and some original source documents, and also journalistic accounts of that process. So, in other words, DOE, this always amuses me to great end, right, was trying to stuff a particular genie back into a particular bottle, or some particular genies back into particular bottles. I would also point out that and we can learn what the W-54's yield for the Davy Crockett was another way, and that is to go and Freedom of Information Act, the test group director's concept for the test series, the Little Feller 1 and 2 series, and look at the predicted overpressures for the test. And if we look at them, we see that they match up incredibly well for a test device of approximately 20 tons. What a surprise. I note that prompt radiation data is not given, and I wonder if that was sanitized out or just not included or whatever. Okay, the worries here are that for a 20-ton weapon, or one of the worries here, for a 20-ton weapon, nuclear yield, Nuke Map gives it in rem, whatever, is that you have 100 rad radius out to about 2,000 feet, and you have a 500 rad dosage radius out to about 1,400 feet. The minimal delivery range of the Davy Crockett systems were 1,000 feet, and up to 6,500 for the M28, and then up to 1,300 for the M29. The point being, at least somewhat, is that there were a lot of delivery scenarios at the lower end of the range where use of the Davy Crockett would have exposed the people using it, assuming they weren't behind a hill or something like that, or in a trench, to significant dosages of radiation. And, so again, 100, the 100 rad curve is where you have most people, or many people, will show certain symptoms like nausea. You can usually pick it up in blood changes. 500 rads is, 450 rads is usually the LD50 dosage, where 50% of people will die from that dosage if not given medical treatment. So that took me about 8 months to a year to track down the original citations and to pull that data together and to do what DOE explicitly wants you not to do, and explicitly attempts to make impossible for people to do by considering, the jigsaw concept in whatever it's called, the jigsaw principle in declassification, where you're not supposed to declassify enough stuff that people can start putting it together like that. it's amazing what an obsession and a lot of time and can do on that one. So the point being, in part, that we do not have that most people don't have the information necessary to evaluate the museum's claim. You just kind of have to take it on faith. In addition, at the Nuclear Museum here and at other sites, I have observed an ongoing erasure of nuclear weapon project harms, past, present, and ongoing. In this case, on the right, you have the only mention of disproportionate impact of uranium mining harms on Native and Indigenous peoples in the quote-unquote American Southwest. And even that mention was really bad because, in many ways, because it's like, hey, this is the Saudi Arabia of uranium. On the left picture, you can see the distribution of abandoned uranium mines on and near Navajo Nation, and there's a whole colonial history as to why some of those mines were able to be near but not on. I would recommend Tracy Boyle's amazing and outstanding book Wastelanding, going through the history of how it is that Native and Indigenous folks ended up having so much uranium, being involved with so much uranium mining. And then, of course, how those sites ended up being abandoned and not cleaned up. The picture on the right, that placard was removed when that particular exhibit was utterly redone and completely paid for, and all of the didactic text and visuals were paid for, designed, and put in by Urenco about uranium enrichment, commercial uranium enrichment. So now there's a big 20-foot centrifuge, and there's just no mention whatsoever of your potential or actual past, present, future, ongoing environmental injuries. In that section, at least. In the section, the box.
Question for you.
Yes, sir.
Which museum was that at?
I'm sorry?
Which museum was that an exhibit at?
That was the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History here in Albuquerque. I believe that got removed in 2017, I want to say. There's currently a Uranium and You exhibit that, in an abstract sense, talks about the movement of uranium through the environment, but with no mention to the movement of uranium through people, or why we are studying the movement of uranium in the environment, or what the opportunities provided by this particular quote-unquote American Southwest are. Why do these opportunities exist to study the movement of uranium in the environment? It's well, because we had the world's largest open pit uranium mine, and it wasn't really remediated amongst the several hundred other uranium mines that also weren't remediated and that got abandoned. In some cases, I would argue official sites of nuclear weapon heritage cross from just copying from Wikipedia and having kind of a well, that's a questionable take on something, to that's flat out wrong and approaches being a lie. So here again, at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, it's part of the uranium craze exhibit, which is a fascinating period. And so this, in case you can't read it, the card reads, by 1958, the government's uranium stockpile had grown large enough that the AEC decreased uranium subsidies. This spelled the end of the uranium prospecting boom. This is where we get into the harmful effects of radioactivity hadn't been fully appreciated in the early days, whatever those were, of uranium mining, because that goes back to the 1500s. And by the 1970s, many of the early miners began to die of cancer. Companies like Phillips Petroleum, Union Carbide, Kara McGee, and Getty Oil were dominating the industry. In 1952, the United States started sending public health service officials to uranium mines to do environmental and baseline health surveys. So environmental surveys of the mine conditions, which oftentimes were appalling in terms of the amount of dust and the lack of ventilation, and also to begin gathering information from uranium miners. In order to do this, the National Health Service and the Atomic Energy Commission and the mine owners just didn't tell the mine workers, right? So that was part of the agreement. You can talk to our mine workers, but you don't get to suggest to them that there's like any sort of danger from uranium mining or from the conditions of our mining. And the Atomic Energy Commission, despite being for years the sole legal owner of uranium in the United States, just blatantly refused to regulate mine safety, even though it was very clear that there were issues. And so the premature deaths of many U.S. uranium miners were absolutely preventable, and the steps necessary were not taken explicitly because of concerns about price and as rapid availability of uranium reserves to the nuclear weapons projects as possible. Again, Tracy Voiles' Wastelanding has great discussion of that. Radioactive sand. I mean, there's a reading list I can suggest. And we're moving. Oh God, I timed this almost. Excuse me, oh Cthulhu, I timed this almost perfectly. This makes me so happy. Conclusion. So what? Well, first off, and I meant to say this at the beginning, and I'm so terribly sorry. It is a wonderful day for anthropology. Thank you for coming. Conclusion. So what? Right? Again. Official nuclear weapon heritage sites in the United States are a major, if not one of the major places where adolescents, like the number of kids, summer camps at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, where Americans come into contact with nuclear weapon topics, especially, once you're out of high school. And I mean, we didn't really discuss them much in high school. So as places with disproportionate impact because of the relative scarcity of our discussions of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology and the number of people who go through them, it suggests that the information and the way that it's presented there is important because of how many people see it and how widely it is circulated. Museums do social work. This is, right, the Louvre, which I took Russian, not French, but like, hey, kill the king. Now let's turn their palace into a museum, an art museum, and the structure of museums and who is represented, how they are represented, what information you're given, how you're expected to deal with that information, etc. In any case, it's well demonstrated that museums do sociocultural work and that they are articulated with governmentality and the state. In other words, that in the process of going through and experiencing museums, as a social performance, it can act to help to define for us the bounds of citizenship, the nature of citizenship, and what our obligations are or were to the state. Think about like discussions of civil defense as a historical phenomenon versus civil defense, against terrorism attacks as a contemporary discourse. Museums work to order the world, straight up. That is a long-standing historical thing, even for the proto-museums, the people who were collecting all that weird stuff in quote-unquote pre-modern Italy. And official U.S. nuclear weapon sites present a democratically corrosive nuclear mythology that through obscuring and erasing past, present, and past, ongoing, and future nuclear harms, and also by removing examples of political responses, efficacious political responses to non-democratic nuclear weapon choices, makes it more difficult for us to imagine or to conceptualize and to understand nuclear weapons as things that we built that we can take apart and that have a process and a history rather than being ethereal, sublime, existing in the realm of high politics and about which nobody can do anything. Oh, that was pretty much my conclusion on both of them. So I am a PhD student, so of course I have a works cited page. It's partial, which makes me feel terrible. If anybody wants readings or other suggestions, please let me know. And those are the semi-prepared comments, and I appreciate you all sitting through the loosely assembled manic rambling that we're going to call a talk for today. And like I said, that is the first time that I've done it in that particular format because I wanted to focus on a narrative that would let me touch on those points rather than just like a very dry, all right, let's go through the concepts, Foucault, blah, 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 blah. So I'd love feedback if you thought that was efficacious. And if not, next time, the next people will get a better talk. But I'd like to, open it up for questions. And Jeff, if there were any that had already been submitted that you wanted to throw in, or I'll let you handle Q&A.
Sure. So let's start first by thanking our speaker, and we thank our speaker by typing applause in the chat window. So applause, applause. Very good.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any questions in the chat window just yet. So I'll go from pre-submitted questions. So first, why doesn't Illinois have a nuclear museum?
That's a great question. For what, especially considering, of course, right, the University of Chicago, and it's where, 1942 with the first sustained fission reaction, right? So part of what it comes down to is, I would argue, Chicago was not a production site or design laboratory for either the Manhattan Project or the nuclear weapons complex during the Cold War. Most of the official U.S. nuclear weapon heritage sites are associated with service museums, with museums that are near, run by, or still articulated to, in some ways, nuclear weapon parts of the nuclear weapon complex. So, for instance, the Bradbury at Los Alamos is straight up run and operated by the Los Alamos, National Laboratory. Los Alamos Historical Society. The Atomic Heritage Foundation does amazing work, right? And I'm glad to see that they have a walking tour. This gets to the very heart of the question of what is official nuclear heritage, or what is nuclear heritage. Period. Why doesn't Illinois have a nuclear weapon museum, although you do have official nuclear weapon heritage sites? Another thing, right after the Cold War and after you started mothballing and shutting down sites, many of those production sites, including at Oak Ridge, for instance, became museums or became, sites of heritage preservation. Trinity site, the site of the first U.S. nuclear weapons test, is a fascinating example of those sorts of politics where, the U.S. National Park Service wanted to immediately turn it into a place where Americans could visit all year round. And the Army and Army Air Force were like, that's a missile testing site. And so, they fought about it for the last 75 years, to the point where the U.S. Army burned down the remaining control bunkers from the Manhattan Project in a fit of spite, basically. They claimed that they were a safety issue. So the politics of nuclear heritage are exactly that, politics. And it's, a matter of funding and who's available, who you have for volunteers, and right? Does the University of Chicago or the state of Illinois wish to invest its identity and funding and policies into a nuclear weapons museum, which has implications for its own presentation of identity and what it did during the Manhattan Project and during the Cold War, right?
True, definitely. Another question: how many Freedom of Information Act requests have you filed? And I can't believe I'm asking this, but how many have been related to Professor Terry?
None on you directly, and I keep meaning to ask for a list of publications with your name. Let me write that down. And I assume they'll redact the titles of some of them based on some of our conversations, but none of them have been explicitly related to Dr. Terry's work. That will change. So remember our comment about information, right? I just cursed it up a storm. Our comments about information management as a form of governmentality. All right, the FOIA process has been difficult for me in that I filed about 100 of them, by the way, at which point the National Nuclear Security Agency decided they didn't like me anymore, and began engaging in a variety of illegal bureaucratic mechanisms to halt, severely restrain, and then basically completely halt my use of the Freedom of Information Act. So in other words, what NNSA and DOE basically did is characterize me as rather than as a commercial requester saying, oh, excuse me, rather than characterizing me as either a news media representative or as a representative of, a member of a university where I'm a PhD candidate requesting documents directly related to my dissertation topic and research. They started classifying me as a commercial requester, which makes any request, even the most simple request, financially prohibitive, right? Because you have to pay all fees for search, all fees for review and duplication and so on. It has now been about a year and 7 or 8 months, and I have lawyers now. And I look forward to a resolution of that situation within the next 18 months. And then I'll have FOIA powers, right? So the wheels of justice turn mighty slow. So when I talk about information management, when I talk about governmentality, the FOIA process has been so incredibly frustrating, annoying, angering, and emotionally taxing that I don't want to keep doing it. And I realize that this is part of by Harry. Thank you for coming. Harry, this is part of the whole point, right? That NNSA doesn't like digging up NNSA doesn't like people asking about the weapons usability of non-metallic plutonium compounds. A lot. That one they gave me a Glomar response to. We can neither confirm nor deny, right? NNSA doesn't like you sending a whole lot of requests, and it's in any case. So there's a round where they say, okay, we need more information off this request. I responded with more information, and they say, okay, we've classified you as commercial, and then you appeal to the DOE Office of Hearing and Appeals, and the DOE OHA says, oh yeah, they're perfect. They did this exactly correct. And then your only remaining options are the Office of Government and Information Services, which are very nice people, but useless, or to sue. And to sue, the first time I went through this, the attorney that I was talking to was like, look, it's a $5,000 to $10,000 off, right out the bat cost. And, I didn't have that money. I still don't have that money. The attorneys that I'm working with currently through the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic are, doing literally hundreds of hours of work pro bono. So if I hadn't been willing to put in
a question about this is Freedom of Information Act business. Would you say it's more partisan in nature or bureaucratic, and is it influenced by the incumbent administration?
It's mixed. Certainly, it seems as though things have been harder to pry out of with FOIA as the last 4 years have continued, that the agencies I work with have gotten a little bit more assertive about trying to screw me over, and others. At the same time, some agencies like the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and the parts of the Air Force have remained delights to work with, and been really professional. In general, in discussing DOE and NNSA, I would tend to say that it's a mixture of bureaucratic, some small partisanship, and institutional socialization, right? I mean, you're socialized to believe that this information is potentially fundamentally dangerous to the national security of the United States. And that's a hard thing to let go of. There's also a lot of embarrassing stuff in there, right? So I had the Freedom of Information Act, the never classified Sandia employee newsletters, 50 years of them. They are on my public archive. Why? I don't really know, but it took about 8 months to a year. And I had to literally say hey, look, I know that these are digitized already. You have to provide them and to me digitized, rather than trying to charge me $1,000 to photocopy 10,000 pages. And it also depends on who the FOIA analyst is too. And, I assume I know that there is also back channel chatter between the FOIA analyst and the agency. So it's really, really, really complicated. And at the end of the day, I would say that the tendency, especially right now, is toward don't release if you don't have to, because that's easier and less problematic, especially for some of the things I'm requesting.
Okay, another question. Any mention of NEPA at all in any museum's official curation? NEPA record is about the only channel through which I can consume hard data about the present day production complex and anything approaching real time. I'm interested generally in your take on NEPA. It clearly doesn't make nukes all that accessible to the general public, but it is there. I'll let you answer that.
NEPA, nuclear energy propulsion, NEPA. Sorry.
National Environmental Protection Act.
Oh, good Lord. Okay, that's moving outside my lane a bit. So but I will say in an essay reading room at UNM, the NEPA documents on environmental impacts for WIP, for instance, are multiple shelves. NEPA has produced an enormous amount of information, more than most of us can go through, and has required new data management techniques for certain people, depending on what they're trying to do. Again, we're getting outside of my lane. Yes, NEPA shakes some things loose. I have argued in the past, and I think that what we're seeing with pit production difficulties at Los Alamos is in part like, hey, you were right? That there was no way we could do the nuclear weapons complex and production activities we did during the Cold War that we could do now because of environmental health and safety regulations. This is also explicitly stated, like if you read Caging the Dragon, which is a history of U.S. nuclear explosive testing, containment, science, and history, built around interviews with people with nuclear explosive test experience. They say the same thing, right? There's no way that you could get away with doing most of what they were doing with current, what they call EH&S regulations. In addition, and I'm sorry, this is getting outside of NEPA, but I just wanted to touch on the GOCO model, the government-owned contractor operated model that we're using. The Government Accounting Office has repeatedly pointed out that, like, hey, the incentive structure that you are using for contractors running these sites incentivizes them to cut every corner they can to make more profit. By Taylor, thank you. And that's a problem. And we've seen that be a problem, for instance, with regards to environmental health and safety, but also following things like plutonium glove box limits at Los Alamos and plutonium work. And, the now somewhat famous picture of the plutonium rods that were put in a glove box so that senior management can get a picture with them, sort of thing. And I'm sorry, that really doesn't answer your question. And that's partly because your question is outside my lane in many ways.
To what extent does stuff like NEPA get compromised on national security grounds?
I mean, everything. This is a standard argument from whatever. I think it's harder now. We could also talk about leaks. In the past, during the Cold War, nuclear weapons production, production was king, right up to the Rocky Flats plant getting raided by the FBI. And that was really, I would argue, the beginning of the shutdown of a warm complex as we would know it, and that was in the late 80s. And then in the 90s, the Cold War ended, 89, 91. The Openness Initiative, the DOE, had to cough up a lot of information about horrific environmental practices that had basically created certain national sacrifice zones. By the way, those are usually referred to as legacy, not heritage, legacy, which is a very different term and implies a very different temporal continuity between the institutions involved. And these are also things that in official heritage sites, those sorts of discourses continue. And it's also always very upbeat, right? Hanford will be cleaned up. And it's like, Hanford is a national sacrifice zone. That place is going to be... As to the extent that, I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do about the complex and NEPA. I know that it's been an issue in terms of immense added cost, added frustration for the people who work in the complex. For instance, at the design labs, my understanding is that the design teams, consistently want to do more experiments that involve materials like plutonium and beryllium, and they feel that environmental safety and health guidelines are preventing them from doing so, and that this is negatively impacting their ability to, be nuclear weapon designers and analysts.
All right, I know we've kept you long. Do you have time for one more question?
I have all the time today. I'm not planning on leaving my apartment, so we can do this for a while.
All right, so then we'll let Bill ask this one because I'm not going to say it. So, Bill,
Oh.
go ahead and mute yourself and
Yeah, okay. It's great to see your body language anyway.
Oh, good. Thank you. And likewise.
Let's come to Chicago sometime afterwards. I was wondering if you could speculate on what your thoughts might be on why the Davy Crockett yield is so sensitive when I think you said the yield of other warheads are have been declassified.
I would, if I may partly clarify and say that most of the yields of other weapons have not been declassified. That literally it's like 3 to 5.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So it is part of a general trend. So there's sort of an overall yield information is classified. That's the rule, right? And apparently, so one of the things I intend to request once I have my once I finish suing and have my write my epic letter to my Congress people and have my FOIA powers back, that's one of the things that I'm going to ask for. What were the deliberations around the declassification or not of the Davy Crockett yield? And hopefully that will potentially offer some insight into that. I don't know why, the Davy Crockett, it does seem as though they took particular care regarding the yield of that weapon. One possibility is that it was the lowest yield weapon deployed by the United States, and that therefore its dimensions, weight, and so on could theoretically offer, some design suggestions about how. Oh, poor Fluff! My cat just made a crap-a-lanch off my desk. Sorry, ignore that. Right, so maybe it was considered as potentially offering some particular design information. I mean, any state with a nuclear weapons program has already, gotten those basics. If you do a let review and you can do exactly what I did and work out what the yield was. The Soviets probably knew either through espionage or through their own nuclear weapons program, or because they also were trying to find out what the smallest diameter, lowest yield weapons that they could deploy for various purposes were. Basically, I don't know, honestly. The answer to your question. The Davy Crockett is unusual in that it is the lowest yield weapon and one of the lowest yield, one of the smallest diameters we deployed, but it's not the smallest diameter. That goes to the W48 M454 6-inch artillery fired atomic projectile, which has a yield probably of about 70 tons, and the diameter is about 6 inches, and that uses a different design, right? It is believed that uses something more akin to a linear implosion design, which stuffs it with plutonium, which is also why that warhead had particular limits on dosage allowed to PN, like you were required to stand 3 feet away from it unless you were actually working on it, sort of thing. I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, but my whole question is, it's less remarkable if every...
Yes, it would be.
Is supposed to be classified. Thank you.
Yeah, and yet, at some point, many of these weapon yields were, I want to say that many of these weapon yields are available through open source speculation that's probably really close to the mark. If you read the restricted data declassification decisions and you correlate between certain nuclear test yields which have been declassified, and if you know the history, you can jigsaw those to, okay, Shot Oak was, a proof test. This is actually declassified now, but we knew it before. Shot Oak was a proof test of the 9 megaton Mark 53 W53 warhead, right? But we also, you can also work out from that the yield of the W25 Genie unguided air-to-air nuclear rocket was 1.7 kilotons because that warhead was used for the Argus shots, and the Argus warhead type, the Argus yields have been declassified, and then from other documents what the warhead was. So the point being that in many ways it's drag or theater, that the information exists in the public sphere, in the nuclear archive in many ways, and that those whom you would most want to keep sensitive nuclear design, weapon design information from all, at potential adversaries, especially for weapons that were retired decades ago. Your potential adversaries already have it, and a developing nuclear weapon state would be able to figure it out. So, from whom are we keeping this secret, and why? And that's where the information, the governmentality aspect comes in, and what official knowledge are you allowed to know, and how. So I think that was the last question. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you for coming. We greatly appreciate it. And look forward to chatting with you again.
Absolutely. I look forward to the debrief and to filing a FOIA for your publications and reports.
Awesome. I'll just send you a copy, save you the trouble.
Well, what I
need is for both of us to go to jail.
Right. One of us needs to bail the other one out. So
That's right.
I'm going to leave the call. Y'all have my Twitter. From that, you can get my email. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for
Take
coming.
care. Thank you for having me.